The grand ballroom of Thornwick Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. It was the annual Harvest Gala, an event that brought together the kingdom's most distinguished guests for an evening of celebration and diplomacy. Prince Edmund Thornwick, heir to the throne of Avelshire, stood at the edge of the marble dance floor, his formal military dress uniform pristine and adorned with the golden sash of his rank. At 54, Edmund carried himself with the practiced composure of someone born to rule, though the years had etched lines of responsibility around his eyes. His marriage to Lady Cordelia Ashworth had been arranged 28 years ago, a union that solidified political alliances and satisfied the expectations of the crown. Their relationship, while respectful and dutiful, had long settled into the comfortable distance that many royal marriages eventually found. The evening progressed with its usual pageantry. Diplomats from neighboring kingdoms mingled with local nobility, their conversations a careful dance of politics and pleasantries. Edmund moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging greetings and discussing matters of state with visiting dignitaries. Cordelia, elegant in her emerald silk gown, maintained her own circle of conversation with the wives of ambassadors and prominent ladies of the court. As the orchestra began the traditional opening waltz, Edmund noticed a figure that made him pause mid-conversation with the Duke of Westmere. Lady Catherine Belmont, the young wife of his son Prince William, stood near the great windows that overlooked the palace gardens. She was 29, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper and a graceful bearing that commanded attention without effort. Catherine had married William 3 years ago in what the kingdom had celebrated as a fairy tale wedding. She had brought a refreshing authenticity to the royal family, someone who had worked as a teacher before her marriage and maintained a genuine warmth despite her new position. Tonight, she wore a midnight blue gown that seemed to flow around her like water, and Edmund found himself studying her profile as she gazed out at the moonlit gardens. There was something different about Catherine that evening. Perhaps it was the way the light fell across her features, or the thoughtful expression on her face as she watched couples beginning to dance, but Edmund felt drawn to her in a way that caught him completely off guard. He had always been fond of his daughter-in-law, appreciating her intelligence and the happiness she brought to William, but this feeling was something else entirely. The Duke of Westmere continued speaking about trade agreements, but Edmund's attention had shifted entirely. He watched as Catherine accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, her movements fluid and natural. When she turned slightly, their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond its actual duration, they simply looked at each other. Catherine smiled, the same warm smile she had always given him, but something in Edmund's chest tightened. He excused himself from the Duke with a polite nod and began making his way across the ballroom toward her. The crowd seemed to part naturally before him, as it always did for royalty, but his steps felt different tonight, purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with royal duty. William was nowhere to be seen, having stepped out to take an important call from the Prime Minister about some urgent matter of state. Cordelia was deep in conversation with the Queen Mother about upcoming charitable events. The ballroom buzzed with its usual energy, but Edmund felt as though he was moving through a dream where only he and Catherine existed. As he approached her, Catherine turned fully toward him, her expression brightening with genuine pleasure at his attention. In that moment, surrounded by the grandeur of the palace and the weight of centuries of tradition, Edmund felt something shift inside him that he hadn't experienced in decades. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly present. It was a connection that seemed to bypass all the careful protocols and formal relationships that defined his world. The orchestra continued to play, couples swirled across the dance floor, and the evening progressed exactly as planned. But, for Prince Edmund Thornwick, something fundamental had changed in the span of those few moments. Something that would set in motion events that neither he nor anyone else in that glittering ballroom could have anticipated. The following weeks passed in a haze of confusion for Edmund. He found himself looking forward to family gatherings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with seeing his son William and everything to do with the possibility of spending time with Catherine. He began finding excuses to visit William's wing of the palace more frequently, officially checking on state papers that could easily have been handled through normal channels. Catherine, for her part, seemed unaware of the shift in her father-in-law's attention. She greeted him with the same warmth she had always shown, asking about his health, sharing amusing stories about her charitable work, and discussing books they had both read. Her natural intelligence and Genuine interest in the world around her made their conversations effortless and engaging in a way that Edmund hadn't experienced in years. During one particularly memorable afternoon, Edmund found Catherine in the palace library, curled up in one of the leather armchairs with a biography of Queen Eleanor of Castleton. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating a golden halo around her auburn hair as she read. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up with that familiar smile. "Your Highness," she said, starting to rise. But Edmund gestured for her to remain seated. "Please, Catherine, there's no need for such formality when it's just us," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "What are you reading?" She showed him the book, and they fell into a discussion about Queen Eleanor's reforms to education and women's rights during her reign 2 centuries ago. Catherine's insights were thoughtful and well-reasoned, and Edmund found himself captivated by the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke passionately about subjects that mattered to her. "I've always admired her courage," Catherine said, closing the book and holding it against her chest. She could have simply accepted the limitations placed on her position, but instead she chose to use her influence to make real changes for people who had no voice. Edmund nodded, but he wasn't really thinking about Queen Eleanor anymore. He was thinking about how Catherine's passion made her even more beautiful, how her convictions reminded him of his own younger self before the weight of duty had worn away his idealistic edges. Their conversations began to extend beyond these chance encounters. Edmund started inviting Catherine to join him for afternoon tea in his private study, ostensibly to discuss her charitable work and how the crown might better support her initiatives. These meetings became the highlight of his week, and he found himself planning what they might talk about, even selecting books from his personal library that he thought might interest her. Catherine seemed to genuinely enjoy their discussions as well. She would arrive with notes about her projects, her enthusiasm infectious as she described the progress they were making with literacy programs in rural communities. But their talks inevitably wandered into more personal territory, their shared love of classical music, their thoughts on philosophy, their dreams of making a meaningful impact on the kingdom. It was during one of these team meetings that Edmund realized how far his feelings had developed. Catherine was describing a visit to a school in one of the poorer districts of the capital, her eyes bright with excitement as she talked about a young girl who had written a poem about her dreams of becoming a doctor. As she spoke, gesturing gracefully with her hands, Edmund found himself studying every detail of her face, memorizing the way she moved, the sound of her laugh. "You're not listening to me at all, are you?" Catherine said suddenly, though her tone was teasing rather than offended. Edmund startled, realizing he had been completely lost in simply watching her. "I apologize, Catherine. I was thinking about how much good you're doing. The kingdom is fortunate to have you." Something in his voice must have conveyed more than he intended, because Catherine's expression shifted slightly. For a moment, she looked at him with a curiosity that hadn't been there before, as if she was seeing him differently. The moment passed quickly, but Edmund felt as though something had been revealed that couldn't be taken back. That evening, as he dressed for dinner, Edmund caught sight of himself in the mirror and was startled by what he saw. His eyes held an energy that had been missing for years, and there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there since his youth. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was falling in love with his son's wife, and for the first time in decades, he felt truly alive. The knowledge terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Every rational part of his mind told him how impossible and dangerous these feelings were. Catherine was married to his son. She was young enough to be his daughter, and any action on his part could destroy his family and potentially the monarchy itself. But despite all of this, Edmund couldn't deny what was happening to him. As he made his way to the family dining room that night, Edmund steeled himself to act normally, to bury these feelings before they could cause any harm. But when he saw Catherine at the dinner table, radiant in a simple cream-colored dress, her wedding ring catching the candlelight as she laughed at something William had said, Edmund knew that whatever was happening between them was far beyond his control. The turning point came during the kingdom's annual arts festival, a week-long celebration that transformed the capital into a showcase of music, theater, and visual arts. As patron of the arts, Edmund was expected to attend various performances and exhibitions, but this year he found himself hoping that Catherine would be present at the events as well. On the third evening of the festival, Edmund attended a private concert at the Royal Opera House, featuring a renowned pianist performing Chopin's complete nocturnes. He arrived early and was surprised to find Catherine already there, sitting alone in the royal box. William had been called away on urgent diplomatic business, and Cordelia was hosting a dinner for visiting dignitaries. "Your Highness," Catherine said as he joined her, "I wasn't expecting anyone else this evening." "Nor was I," Edmund replied, settling into the seat beside her. "But I'm glad for the company. Chopin is meant to be shared, I think." As the lights dimmed and the pianist began the first nocturne, Edmund became acutely aware of Catherine's presence beside him. The music seemed to create an intimate bubble around them, separate from the rest of the world. During the more passionate pieces, he could hear her breathing change slightly, and once, during a particularly beautiful passage, he saw tears glistening in her eyes. During intermission, they walked out onto the opera house's balcony that overlooked the city. The festival had transformed the streets below into rivers of light, with lanterns and decorations creating a magical atmosphere that made the entire capital feel like something from a fairy tale. "It's beautiful," Catherine said softly, her hands resting on the marble balustrade. "Yes," Edmund agreed, though he was looking at her rather than the view. "Catherine, I wanted to thank you." She turned to him with surprise. "Thank me? For what?" "For reminding me why I love this kingdom so much," he said carefully. "Your passion for helping people, your genuine care for our citizens. It's reminded me of what we're supposed to be serving." Catherine smiled, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. "I think you give me too much credit, Your Highness. You've always cared about the people. I've seen how hard you work for them." "Call me Edmund," he said suddenly. "Please, when we're alone like this, just call me Edmund." Something shifted in the air between them. Catherine's eyes searched his face, and, for a moment, Edmund thought he saw recognition there, an awareness of the undercurrent that had been building between them for weeks. "Edmund," she said softly, testing his name on her lips. The sound of it sent a thrill through him that he struggled to hide. They were interrupted by the chiming of the intermission bell, calling them back inside. As they returned to their seats, Edmund's hand briefly touched Catherine's elbow to guide her, and he felt her slight intake of breath. The second half of the concert passed in a haze of music and tension, with both of them seemingly aware of every small movement the other made. The weeks that followed were a careful dance around the growing attraction between them. Edmund found reasons to include Catherine in more official functions, always with proper justification, but with the private knowledge that he simply wanted to be near her. Catherine, meanwhile, seemed to sense the change in their dynamic, but appeared uncertain how to respond to it. The situation reached a crisis point during a state dinner honoring the visiting king of Valdoria. The evening was proceeding normally, with Edmund performing his usual role as host while Cordelia charmed the foreign dignitaries. Catherine sat between William and the Valdorian crown prince, engaging in the expected diplomatic conversation with grace and intelligence. But throughout the evening, Edmund found his attention constantly drawn to Catherine. He noticed how she listened intently to others, how she asked thoughtful questions about Valdorian culture, how she made everyone around her feel genuinely heard. When she laughed at something the crown prince said, Edmund felt a stab of what he reluctantly recognized as jealousy. As the evening progressed, the guests moved from the dining room to the palace's grand salon for dancing and entertainment. Edmund dutifully danced with various ladies, including Cordelia and several diplomatic wives, but his eyes kept finding Catherine across the room. She was dancing with William when their eyes met across the crowded floor. The look that passed between them was electric, filled with all the words they hadn't spoken and feelings they hadn't acknowledged. For a moment, the rest of the room seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them connected by an invisible thread of understanding and longing. William, oblivious to the exchange, spun Catherine gracefully, and when she faced Edmund again, her cheeks were flushed and her breathing slightly elevated. In that moment, Edmund made a decision that would change everything. He began walking toward them, his intention clear in his stride. The music was winding down to its conclusion, and, as the final notes played, William kissed Catherine's hand gallantly before being called away by an aide who whispered something urgent in his ear about a telephone call from the Prime Minister. Catherine stood alone on the edge of the dance floor, slightly breathless from the waltz, when Edmund reached her. The orchestra was beginning the next piece, a slow, romantic melody that seemed to wrap around them like a cocoon. Without thinking about propriety or consequences or the 100 pairs of eyes that might be watching, Edmund extended his hand toward Catherine. Not to Cordelia, who was standing just a few feet away in conversation with the Queen Mother, but to Catherine, his daughter-in-law, his son's wife, the woman he had fallen desperately in love with. The moment Edmund's hand extended toward Catherine, time seemed to suspend itself in the grand salon. The orchestra continued playing their romantic waltz, but the melody felt distant, like music heard through water. Catherine stared at his outstretched hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and recognition. Around them, the diplomatic gathering continued its elegant dance of conversation and politics, but several keen observers had begun to notice the unusual tableau. Lady Pemberton, the sharp-eyed wife of the foreign minister, paused mid-sentence in her discussion with the Valdorian ambassador. The Duke of Thornfield, Edmund's longtime advisor, felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. Most significantly, Cordelia herself had turned at precisely the wrong moment. She had been graciously accepting compliments on the evening's arrangements from the Queen Mother when something drew her attention to the dance floor. Perhaps it was the quality of silence that had fallen over a small section of the room, or perhaps it was simply the intuition that develops in long marriages when something fundamental shifts. Catherine looked from Edmund's hand to his face, and in his eyes she saw everything he had been trying to hide for months. The careful conversations, the lingering glances, the way he had begun to light up when she entered a room, it all suddenly made sense. Her own feelings, which she had been pushing down and refusing to examine, rose to the surface like bubbles breaking through water. For weeks, she had told herself that the warmth she felt in Edmund's presence was simply familial affection, that the way her heart raced during their private conversations was just excitement about their shared interests. But, standing there, with his hand extended in invitation and his heart clearly visible in his expression, she could no longer deny what had been growing between them. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings. This was her husband's father, the future king. She was married to William, had made vows before God and country. Any acknowledgement of what Edmund was offering would be catastrophic for everyone involved. The scandal would destroy the monarchy, tear apart the family she had grown to love, and ruin countless lives. But another part of her, a part that had been awakening slowly over the months of their friendship, whispered that sometimes the heart wants what it wants, regardless of duty or expectation or consequence. In Edmund's eyes, she saw not just desire but genuine love, understanding, and a connection that she had never experienced before, not even with William. The moment stretched on, though in reality only seconds had passed. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a simple invitation to dance between family members. But, to those who were paying attention, the tension was unmistakable. The very air seemed charged with possibility and danger. Cordelia took a step forward, her face carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with sudden understanding. She had lived with Edmund for 28 years, had learned to read his moods and motivations with the skill of a diplomat. She recognized the look on his face because she had once inspired it herself. In the early days of their arranged marriage, before duty and routine had settled over their relationship like dust on unused furniture. Catherine's hand began to rise, almost without her conscious volition. She could feel the weight of years of proper behavior, of living according to expectation and protocol, warring with this moment of pure, honest feeling. Around them, conversations had begun to falter as more people noticed the strange tableau playing out on the dance floor. William chose that moment to return from his telephone call, entering the salon with his usual confident stride. He was discussing something with his aide, his attention focused on matters of state, completely unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. He looked up just as Catherine's fingers were about to touch his father's palm. "Catherine," William's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Father? Is everything all right?" The spell broke. Catherine's hand jerked back as if burned, and Edmund's arm dropped to his side. The color drained from Catherine's face, while Edmund's expression settled into the careful mask he had perfected over decades of public life. "Of course," Edmund said smoothly, though his voice carried just the slightest tremor. "I was simply asking Catherine for a dance while we waited for your return. I hope you don't mind sharing your lovely wife for one waltz." William smiled, completely missing the undercurrents swirling around him. "Of course not, Father. Catherine is an excellent dancer. I'm sure you'll both enjoy it." But the moment had passed, and everyone in their small circle knew it. Catherine managed a shaky smile and murmured something about feeling slightly faint from the heat. Cordelia stepped forward with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to smoothing over awkward social moments. "Perhaps some air would help," Cordelia suggested, her voice perfectly pleasant even as her eyes remained fixed on her husband's face. "The gardens are lovely this evening." As Catherine excused herself and headed toward the terrace doors. Edmund watched her go with an expression that revealed too much to anyone who cared to look. The moment of possibility had collapsed into awkwardness and unspoken recrimination, but the feelings that had driven it remained unchanged. Lady Pemberton exchanged a meaningful glance with the Duke of Thornfield. The Queen Mother's eyebrows had risen almost imperceptibly, and Cordelia, her social smile never wavering, filed away this moment for future consideration. The evening continued, but the careful equilibrium of the royal family had been disturbed in ways that none of them fully understood yet. What had almost happened on that dance floor would ripple through their relationships like stones thrown into still water, creating consequences that would ultimately force them all to confront truths they had been carefully avoiding. In the days following the state dinner, an uncomfortable tension settled over the royal family, like fog rolling in from the sea. Edmund threw himself into his official duties with renewed intensity, accepting every engagement and traveling commitment that would keep him away from the palace. He seemed to be running from something, though he would never have admitted it, even to himself. Catherine, meanwhile, retreated into her charitable work with an almost desperate energy. She scheduled back-to-back visits to schools, hospitals, and community centers, filling her days so completely that she would return to her apartments exhausted and fall into dreamless sleep. But even in her busiest moments, she found her thoughts drifting to that almost moment on the dance floor, to the look in Edmund's eyes, and to feelings she still couldn't quite name. Cordelia, ever observant, noticed everything. She watched her husband's sudden dedication to his calendar, saw Catherine's frantic schedule, and recognized the careful way they now avoided being in the same room together. At family dinners, Edmund would arrive precisely on time and leave as soon as politeness allowed. Catherine would focus intently on William's conversations, asking detailed questions about his work that kept the attention away from herself. It was Cordelia who finally forced the issue. 2 weeks after the state dinner, she arranged for William to be sent on a diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, a trip that was legitimately necessary but had been planned with careful timing. On the day of William's departure, she invited Catherine for afternoon tea in her private sitting room. Catherine arrived expecting one of their usual discussions about upcoming charity events or social obligations. Instead, she found Cordelia waiting with an expression that was both kind and implacably determined. "Please sit, Catherine," Cordelia said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Catherine felt her stomach drop, but she maintained her composure. "Of course. What would you like to discuss?" Cordelia poured the tea with steady hands, but when she looked up, her eyes were sharp with understanding. "I've been married to Edmund for 28 years, my dear. I know him better than anyone, and I know when something has changed." For a moment, Catherine considered deflecting, maintaining the pretense that nothing had happened. But sitting across from this woman who had shown her nothing but kindness since her marriage to William, she found she couldn't lie. "I never meant for anything to happen," Catherine said quietly. "I don't even know what did happen exactly. We were just talking, spending time together as family, and then, suddenly, you realized that you cared for each other in ways that went beyond family affection," Cordelia finished gently. "Catherine, you're not the first woman to fall in love with my husband, and you won't be the last. Edmund has always had that effect on people." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Cordelia. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I love William, I do. But with Edmund I feel understood, truly seen, like you can be completely yourself without pretending or performing." Cordelia's voice was understanding rather than accusatory. "I remember that feeling. It's intoxicating, isn't it?" Catherine nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea and watching the afternoon light play across her sitting room walls. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "Edmund and I married for duty," she said finally. "We learned to care for each other, to respect each other, and to build a life together. But we've never had what I suspect you found with him. The question now is what we're going to do about it." Catherine looked up in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we have choices to make," Cordelia said calmly. "We can pretend that nothing has changed, that there are no feelings involved, and watch as this tension slowly destroys our family. Or we can acknowledge the reality of the situation and find a way to move forward that honors both duty and truth." Over the next hour, the two women talked with an honesty that surprised them both. Cordelia revealed that she had long suspected Edmund was capable of a deeper love than their marriage had ever achieved. Catherine admitted that her feelings for William, while genuine, had always felt more like deep affection than passionate love. The irony, Cordelia said at one point, is that if circumstances were different, if you weren't married to William, if the succession wasn't at stake, Edmund's feelings for you might actually make him a better king. You bring out something in him that I haven't seen in years. When Edmund returned from his latest trip that evening, he found both women waiting for him in his study. The sight of them sitting together, clearly having talked, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Edmund," Cordelia said as he hesitated in the doorway, "please come in. We need to discuss what happens next." What followed was perhaps the most honest conversation the three of them had ever had. Edmund, faced with no choice but to acknowledge his feelings, spoke with a painful honesty about the loneliness he had felt for years and the unexpected joy Catherine had brought into his life. Catherine, with tears streaming down her face, talked about the impossibility of her situation and her terror of hurting people she loved. And Cordelia, displaying a strength and grace that surprised even her, proposed a solution that none of them had considered. "The kingdom needs stability," she said finally. "William needs to inherit a throne that isn't shadowed by scandal. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way to be honest about our feelings while still protecting what matters most." What they eventually decided would shock some and inspire others, but it would be their decision, made with full knowledge of the consequences and with respect for all involved. The moment when Edmund had reached for Catherine instead of Camilla, instead of duty over heart, had begun something that couldn't be undone. But, perhaps, they realized, it didn't need to be. Sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the most profound truths, and sometimes the greatest act of love is finding a way to honor both the heart and the obligations that bind us to others. For Prince Edmund, Lady Catherine, and Lady Cordelia, that autumn afternoon marked not an ending, but a beginning of something entirely new.